Law enforcement and government agencies struggle with parking citations, often because no one will pay them. Boots or other devices are costly, and they invite confrontation when implied and later removed by enforcing employees. With Tire Tag, you can avoid many hurdles and ultimately promote public safety and revenue collection. To learn more, visit tiretag.com. Welcome to Blue Grit Radio, the podcast that explores making better cops for a better community. I'm your host, Eric Tung. I've been an active police officer since 2007. We will dive into the aspects of police culture, health and wellness, leadership, and mindset. You'll hear from experts not only from policing, but all industries as they relate to being our best with purpose, passion, and positivity. Join me as we share stories, lessons, and advice so we can all be better for ourselves, our teams, our families, and our communities. Ladies and gents, welcome back to another episode of Blue Grit Radio. Today, I'm joined by Robyn. We've been talking about all these conversations as they relate to first responder wellness and providing care, but then also taking some different angles with it. So I'm super excited to have you on here. But without further ado, Robyn, thanks for coming on the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So we got connected through our mutual connect, Dr. Brooke. Shout out to Dr. Brooke Bartlett, prior guest here on the show. So we'll probably have to have her back and have a little panel here with you and little reunion of sorts.
Yes, I would love that.
Yeah, but please, for the audience, could you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about how you came into your work?
Yeah, so my name's Robyn Sonnier. I'm a licensed clinical therapist. I am based in Lafayette, Louisiana, but I'm licensed in the states of Louisiana, Arizona, and North Carolina. I have been a therapist for 10 years. I know I don't look that old, but I did go to college at 17.
Wow,
So
look at
that,
you.
that kind of gave me a little bit of entry. And then I went straight to graduate school right after that. My graduate program at the time was just a 2-year program. They've expanded the master's program since. So it's that's a little bit of why I can say, 10 years now. But I specialize in trauma, OCD, and military and first responder counseling. I also offer free sessions for veterans in my practice. And then I do financial assistance and a first responder discount as well. And then I primarily approach my therapy with my clients from an EMDR and IFS integrated model. And yeah, that's, I think, a good little general gist for me.
Yeah, that's a great little crash course. So, first off, pretty soon you're not going to apologize for looking young. And then people are like, dang
Yeah.
you for looking young. Have you? I mean, I've gotten it basically my whole career and I'm not ashamed and I'm embracing it now my door is being knocked on by 40. So that's a thing. But did you find it to be challenging when you were getting your career started?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. It was definitely difficult being younger, especially, like I said, because I went to my bachelor's, obviously, but went to college at 17 years old. And as I went straight into my master's, I don't know how old I was at that point, 20 something. I don't know. I'm horrible with math, but it was definitely interesting because my first real clinical work as an intern was with much older people usually and
Hmm.
or people older than me, just no one really my age. So I definitely had a lot of pushback of what are you supposed to be able to tell me? How are you
Hmm.
supposed to be able to help me? You haven't even lived yet, which was valid in a lot of ways, but we pushed through and here I am. And now I see clients of all ages and it works well.
Yeah, absolutely. And clearly you have the acumen, the professional expertise, the tenure, if you will, the
Yeah.
10-year tenure. But
Mm,
for sure, for me, that was the thing too. I've talked a lot about that for the benefit of the younger cops that get started when they're 21, 22, but also like, let's just say like young appearance, right? Like baby faced cops
yeah.
out there. And so I do want to nudge to that, but also there's a lot of clinicians that do listen to this show and others like it. And so do you have anything that helped, or was it just like cutting your teeth and just pushing through?
Yeah, no, it was definitely cutting my teeth pushing through.
Mm,
Yeah. And I will say I really cared about making sure that my clinical expertise matched, so I am very highly trained. If you look at my website or if you look at the letters behind my name, it kind of shows that. But that really comes from a place of really trying to prove, to others that they can trust in the care that I'm providing, that I'm not just saying, that I can do this work, but that I'm actually proving that I can do this work by taking the trainings, doing a little bit more than what is the baseline. So as therapists, we have a baseline for trainings that we have to have in order to get our license, right? But I always exceed that. But that's really important to me because I want my clients to feel like they're getting quality care.
yeah. Yeah, no, that's legit. And so for those that haven't heard me say it before, if you are like a younger cop or younger appearing, or you just feel inexperienced, even though you have, a little bit of time, a couple years, which is like 5 years now in today's terms for the
Yeah.
policing industry. But I like to remind people, like, don't try to be something you're not. Like, present genuinely, and most of the
Mhm.
time people will meet you halfway, right? Like, they don't need you or want you to know everything, but if you act like they do, then they're going to try to call you out on it. Um,
100%.
yeah, and then on the other hand, like, believe in yourself, right? Like, you have the competence, and if you don't, then that's what you work on, and then with that,
Mhm.
the confidence will follow.
Yeah, and we all start somewhere, we all have to start at the same place, really and truly, so.
Yeah, absolutely. So
Mhm.
why mental health providing? Why caring for others in this way and serving others is in this way? And then maybe we can even get into like why first responders and where you
Yeah.
specialize there.
Yeah. So I always make the joke that therapists either have their own shit or they have a God complex. It's one of the two, right? And so usually the good ones are the ones that are coming to the mental health field because they have experienced some kind of struggle, whether it's with their own mental health or witnessing family members with their mental health struggles, whatever that might be. But so for me, I think mental health was always just a pull on my heart. Fun fact, I was actually going to go to law school. So my
Oh, wow.
grandfather and my aunt in the South, we say nanny, so godmother, my nanny and my
Mm,
grandfather were both attorneys. I worked for my nanny, during the summers and was like, oh yeah, this is what I want to do. And she was like, no, it's not. It's really not what you want to do. I promise. Went to LSU and I was getting my bachelor's in psychology, took a class on abnormal psychology, which was all about mental health diagnoses and just, that clinical presentation, and absolutely fell in love, and then decided to go the master's route. I really wanted to do a doctorate, similar to Brooke. I wanted to do a doctorate, but I am a student loan girl. My parents cannot, afford to pay for my
mm,
college, and I was already having to take out student loans for my bachelor's. So when you do the psychology route, you can't work during that time either.
mm,
So it would have just been astronomical debt for me on top of the already student loans that I was going to have. So I
yeah.
did the master's route, and love it. So a licensed clinical, therapist at a master's level, but I am actually going back to get my doctorate now. So I'm getting a
Oh,
doctorate of professional counseling now, not a psychologist, but so that's kind of how I came to mental health. Just really fell in love with it in my bachelor's degree. And really, it just feels like it was kind of always meant for me. It was always something that was in my life. I just didn't always see it as in my life until I was in the field, if that makes sense.
yeah, absolutely. No, I love that. Thank you for sharing that. And I think that so many people, when we do try to mentor those or we try to provide that context, I feel like a lot of really driven young individuals, and I'm sure you were there the way the way you're kind of recapping and starting college at 17, you feel like you have to have it all figured out. And I try
Mhm.
to remind people and even people that I coach or mentor remotely, just saying like, hey, like, you are ahead of the curve. It might not feel like it and you're hitting some obstacles, but you got to be patient. Like, you're doing so much, like
Mhm.
you're building all the framework that it will pan out. And maybe if it's not this one thing, like, you have to be confident. And I'm confident that you're building all the right blocks to get you where you're supposed to be. And I love how
Yeah.
you just took a course and you're like, this is the thing.
And I think that's life, right? We have to be flexible. It's the same for you guys in your profession. There may be some collateral duty that you think you're really interested in, and then you learn about it and you're like, never mind. I always thought I was going to do motors or something, but it's not actually for you. And I think it's just a matter of being flexible in life for wherever it's kind of taking you.
Yeah, be open, be accepting, be
Mhm.
patient. And I mean, it makes me think about what we're gonna talk about, which is self compassion, right? Like, a lot of
Yeah.
these hard chargers are like very hard critics on, I'll say ourselves. And I know this about you from
Yeah.
connecting with you already. But yeah, just like be open to the road and where it goes. So
Hmm.
you introed with EMDR, and a lot of people are familiar with that. And I encourage
Yeah.
people to search engine that if you're not. And we won't deviate too much there because I do want to bring it to IFS and what
Yeah.
you mentioned there. So what is IFS?
Yeah, so internal family systems, that's what IFS stands for. It is a psychotherapy modality. It's evidence-based, compassion-driven, and non-pathologizing. So what that means is we're really not looking at a diagnosis when we're thinking about different presenting issues, you could say, from an IFS lens. It is really more so about this basis of understanding that we as humans have different parts or sub-personalities of who we are that are created as a result of our lived experiences, right? And so these parts develop as we go through life, as we experience things, as we experience trauma, etc. right? And these parts come on and they take on these roles, and these roles have what we say positive intent for our overall system. So with IFS, we're really looking at building a relationship with our parts to understand where they came from, why they're doing what they're doing, and what wounds they're protecting or trying to kind of suffice so that
Mhm.
we can help those wounds get healed. It sounds really freaking weird at first. I'm not going to lie to you. When I first got into IFS, I thought it was the weirdest shit ever. And I'm a pretty like open-minded person. And I was like, what in the actual hell am I learning
Yeah,
right
so what
now?
took you there then? Or was it just
Yeah.
exploring that?
So, like I said, I'm a training junkie. I love to learn and I love to take trainings, and I specialize in trauma. That's kind of always been my specialty. And trauma's great, EMDR is great. There's a lot of great modalities out there, but it always kind of felt like something was missing. And I don't even remember how I got specifically to this one training, but I know a good friend of mine who's also a mentor and one of my consultants actually. He's a Marine who does IFS, and that's his big wig stuff. And he always talks so highly about it. So I think I took this 3-day intro training to IFS, and it's like everything clicked. Everything that
Hmm.
I felt like was missing with my trauma clients just made so much more sense from this perspective. And then what I love about IFS is it's not just great for trauma, it's really great for our whole lives, like for who
Yeah.
we are as humans, for working with clients. It helped me personally and professionally. It's cool stuff. Like once you understand it, because again, it's weird as shit at first, but once you start to understand it, it's really, I would say, powerful and empowering because you really get to learn a little bit more about why you're doing the things you're doing, especially if something that you're doing you don't want to be doing. It just is a
Mm.
really compassionate and curious approach to figuring that out versus kind of attacking yourself and coming on to yourself saying you have a problem or you shouldn't be doing XYZ or you're a horrible person for drinking every night or whatever that might be, right?
Yeah, yeah, and you say it's like super weird, and I'm intrigued, and we were talking about it
Mhm.
a little bit before, and I hadn't heard or I don't recall hearing that acronym or that description,
Mhm.
but then as you go into it more, I'm like, no, maybe I have heard about this, right? And so we'll get into the nuance there, but I actually think that a lot of first responders may resonate with it and they might
Mhm.
have their eyebrows and their ears perking up because what I heard earlier on, and I'm going to highlight for those that might have missed, is like it's non-pathological was the word, correct?
Yep,
And so we don't like I mean, who wants to be labeled? And I certainly
exactly.
don't, like, I don't wanna be called a blank or, "Hey, you have this condition or you have this disorder." And, we talked a lot about PTSD, like, on the show
Mhm.
or just in the community and how that can only make the stigma worse when "Oh, now I'm disordered," rather than having a condition, right? But even the
Yep.
condition, right? A label or just, any label can carry with it a lot of emotion. So I want to talk a little bit more about that. So when it's not like putting a label like, hey, you don't have
Mhm.
this thing, what helps people, I suppose, where would we start in having people understand a little bit more contextually or like an example?
Yeah, yeah. So I can share a personal example for myself, right? So when I was young, I used to be left with my grandmother a lot. Loved my grandmother. She was a great grandmother, but she definitely was suffering from mental illness. And
Mm,
a part of her mental illness included some hoarding behavior, just a really unkempt house. She
mhm,
was frequently, at the time, I didn't understand what was happening, but she was frequently drunk and passed out at her computer. And I was just this little bitty tot left alone, often like cleaning up after my grandmother. Okay.
mhm.
So I have a part that shows up today in my life that everything needs to be clean. Everything
Sure.
needs to be clean,
Yeah.
organized, has a space. For me, I like that part. So in IFS, we would call that a manager part. It's proactive. So it's making sure that my wounds aren't activated at all. And so it's very proactive. So that part of me that likes to keep everything clean, everything has a space, almost at times like a little neurotic. My friend will jokingly be like, "Are you cleaning your baseboards today?" Because
Mhm.
I get like that, right? So
Yeah.
that part of me developed in response to that childhood wound, right? Of being left with someone who wasn't really present and taking care of her house or really of me. Does that make sense a
Yeah,
little bit
no, for
there?
sure, for sure. It's like it's trying to understand or maybe give like a reason, not to, and maybe like correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm wondering maybe is it just giving awareness and understanding to why I might feel this way or why I might be predisposed towards acting this way? Like give me some like giving
Yeah.
me some sort of context so I don't have to Maybe I just get more clarity out of it.
Clarity is a big piece of it. It's just kind of getting some clarity and some understanding. So when I'm working with first responders, a lot of common parts we would say for them would be like an emotional suppressor, right? Even hypervigilance at times, the suck it up part, right? Suck
Hmm.
it up, you got to get through it, suck the teeth, let's get it going. Even burnout. Let's see, what are some other good examples? A busy bee,
Yeah.
even sometimes like more angry, kind of not, I don't want to say aggressive in a negative connotation, but more aggressive in their kind of presentation. That stoic part, right? All those are good common parts. But then we also have things like very heroic, defending, protector, right? Some cops are very clean and organized, especially when it comes to their units, right? Or their uniform. So
Hmm.
we have different parts. And if we can kind of understand why these parts are showing up, and in IFS we say doing the job, then it helps, I think, to just give a little compassion and space. So instead of saying, like, I have a drinking problem, instead it would be something like, there's a part of me that turns to alcohol,
Mm.
and I'm curious to understand why that part keeps showing up in my life. Does that make a
Yeah.
little bit more sense?
Yeah, and so even if I could go there with your example, so
Hmm.
some approaches may or some people may have either a perception or an experience where a certain clinician might be like, okay, let's explore that. How did that make you feel? And let's talk about your grandma. Like, what are your emotions with your grandma? Whereas I don't necessarily hear that and tell me if I'm wrong, but it's almost more like, okay, now I can understand why I show up in this way, and like, there's
Yeah,
nothing wrong with being clean, but if you
right.
feel like so maybe anxious about needing to, then that could help you
Hmm.
understand with compassion and grace, like, okay, I know why I have this tendency to do this. It's not saying like I'm wrong or anything, but if I want to curb it, then that helps me understand the why.
Yeah, absolutely. And then also
Okay.
helps us to gain insight into what the wound is, right? That might need healing.
Hmm.
So, another example, and especially to kind of get into the self compassion piece, right, would be that inner critic or that perfectionist part that a lot of times we all as people, but especially first responders, will take on, right? This kind of like harsh inner critic talking. If we were to look at that as a part, right, that part has a positive intent for the system, and it's usually a motivator, right? So criticism in the past has been researched as being a motivating tool, right? So if I call myself a lazy piece of shit, I'll probably get off the couch and go for a walk, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
But there's a lot of negative drawbacks that come with some of that verbiage, right?
Yeah.
So
For
we
sure.
might have a little bit more anxiety, depression, negative self-image, etc. So IFS is very self-compassion driven, where it helps us to see this part is really just trying to help us to feel better about ourselves, or to avoid negative criticism, or to make sure that we're doing our best at the job, et cetera, right? So it's going to be individualized. Not everyone's parts are the same, even though we may have the same looking parts, everyone's different. And then getting to understand what those parts need to either heal and take on a new role completely. So, for example, it might mean that this part doesn't show up in criticism anymore, but instead more compassionate, like, hey, we would feel a lot better if we got off the couch and maybe went for a walk, instead of, hey, you're being a lazy piece of shit, get off the couch and go
Mm,
for a walk, right?
yeah. Hmm.
Or those parts may like just soften and relax and be more choice driven instead of compulsion driven. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah, and when you give that example, I venture to believe, and I'm pondering this as I'm talking, so I venture to believe that a lot of us may default into that get up you lazy fat,
Yeah.
whatever, right? Like, and that's what has made us successful in the past, but then that becomes like the trail we keep traveling down, and that
Mhm.
trail gets deeper and deeper, right? And unless we are aware of these concepts, we don't even realize that we're doing it to ourselves. We don't realize that's what got us up. But as you point out, it might get us up and doing the thing, but it does have its downstream consequences.
Yep.
Different than, "Hey, Eric, you got this beautiful day outside. You were a badass last week when you worked out. Go be a badass again." Right? Like,
Mhm.
what a different shift, right? And we do, I mean, that becomes a part of us, and it's more than just how we feel. It's our brain chemicals, and they're all intertwined, right? Like, it's
Yep.
actual physical and physiological response too, right?
Yep. Yeah, 100%. Yeah. And I think the other cool thing about IFS that I just want to plug, especially for your audience, is you can start to do IFS work independently without a therapist.
Yeah, that's
So
intriguing.
in IFS, right, your system is really in charge. You're getting to know yourself better in this way and helping to understand the why and what those parts need to, essentially heal, right? Whatever that looks like. So you can start to do that work totally independently. Now, a therapist is obviously going to be a helpful guide for that, especially if they're trained to do IFS parts work. It's obviously better to have a guide when you're doing something new.
Sure, yeah.
But for anyone listening, you don't have to go to therapy to start doing this. You can totally do this work independently.
Yeah, so I'm curious because, a lot of us that tune into this show, it self-selects a bit, right? We talk about
Mhm.
reflection and introspection, but
Mhm.
for those that are new to it, they might be like, "Okay, cool, like it sounds good. Like how do you start introspecting, right? Like how do
Yeah.
you become reflective?" And so with that, like, okay, that sounds good, Robin, but like unless I have an objective guide on this journey, so maybe that would be the primer as you kind of feel it out on your own and you get more comfortable, but like how would one start with this process?
Yeah. So this can look different for different people. There are obviously audiobooks, podcasts, things of that nature that people can listen to. There's books. So Dick Schwartz, who created IFS, he has a book. It's called No Bad Parts. So No Bad Parts. It's on Audible and physical copy. I always recommend the Audible version to my clients because there's exercises in there. So it's easier to obviously participate in an exercise when you're listening to it rather than reading it. But really, I would just encourage you to start looking at maybe there's a behavior that you're doing that you don't love about yourself or your partner doesn't love about you or whatever that might be, right?
Date
And
night
so you
topic. Let's
start
go. Yeah.
yeah, maybe your partner doesn't like how often you're drinking alcohol, right? Or how
Mhm.
often you're, numbing out with a video game or whatever that looks like. But
Yeah.
if you could start to be curious about the why you do that and what would happen if you didn't, like, what is that part scared of happening if you didn't drink alcohol, right? And so a good example might be, well, if I don't do this numbing activity, the emotions from the job are going to be so fucking overwhelming. I'm going to kill myself. Right. So that substance abuse part in that way serves a very important role for your system because it feels like you don't have any other tools to achieve that job except for that. Does that make sense a little bit?
Yeah. Yeah. It does. It does. And so, man, I want to go a couple different places, but at first, I'm trying to decide which way to go. One thing that comes up because you've mentioned drinking, and I think a lot of people can conceptualize that one. What about something and you kind of mentioned it, right? Like that busy body and that busy work,
Mm-hmm.
and what about like the workaholics? And that's
Mm-hmm.
that I suspect there's a strong presence that listen to this show, and I am a workaholic in progress and process and progress, right? So that I think that's a common one, especially when we talk so much about over identity with the job.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, I think it varies again individually. So it definitely varies per person. But commonly, what I will see with an workaholic, especially in the first responder population specifically, might be this need to prove something, right? And when we're looking at a need to prove something, there's usually a rooted wound of not feeling good enough. So
Hmm.
not to call you all out, but
No, it's true. It's
is
true.
there a part, right, of you that maybe like when you were younger or maybe even when you were older, maybe a critical incident happened and you didn't handle it the way that you really wish you would have, and then you start to take on, I'm not good enough at this job, right? So then you're working because you're trying to prove to yourself and or maybe others that you are good at this job, right?
Yeah.
Or that you can learn how to do this job effectively or whatever that may look like. Or I typically see sometimes too, it's an avoidance of home, right?
Yeah.
Sometimes we have the workaholics that are trying to avoid home and really looking at what that might be, right? What are they afraid of if they did spend more time home? Maybe that they would have to face that their marriage isn't in the best place or that their kids are really difficult for them. Everyone wants to just love their kids, obviously, but kids can be assholes, right? And they
Yeah.
can
They're
be
hard.
really challenging.
Yeah.
And so sometimes people are afraid of, well, if I'm home more and I'm feeling super overstimulated, I'll lose it on my kids and then I'll be a bad, and then if
Hmm.
I'm a bad parent, You see how it kind of goes on and on.
Yeah, it really does, right? Because we're familiar. I think those that have been in the job for a little while or heard trainings and speaking about this, right? Like when we do well at work, then you're effective, right? And then
Mhm.
in some ways, the job, especially with hypervigilance and looking out for danger, like the more effective you are at those types of skills and skill sets, the less effective you are if you don't toggle it right. Like so if I'm
Yep.
looking out for danger at home, of course, that doesn't translate well when my family's just trying to talk to me, right?
Yep.
Or if I'm distracted by whether it's work product like your phone and things like that, or you're just not present, right? Or you're numbing,
Mhm.
as you pointed out, right? So it can certainly snowball when I am at home and I've just had a rough day. Maybe it's not a crazy rough day. It's just a rough day. I'm just
Yep.
exhausted and I'm not showing up well. Well, shoot, what do I want to do? Then I want to go back to work where I was getting high fives, where my boss was saying, hey, thank you for coming in because we're short staffed. Like, I'm actually getting
Mm.
recognition beyond just actually doing poorly or nothing.
Yep.
So yeah,
Yeah.
it's a slippery
100%.
slope for sure. But I would challenge those. Like if you recognize that in yourself, then there is something that needs to be addressed there, right? It's you can redline for a little bit, but we all know that that's going to snap at some point, and it's just gonna you're gonna kick the can into something
Yeah.
that's going to be harder to curb later.
Yeah. 100%.
Yeah. Do you get into solutions or do you have, I mean, on that topic, just so we leave listeners with something, you're like, man, I'm
Yeah.
kind of flirting with that at times. Like what can I take on or what are your takes that you like to have people start with?
Yeah, so once we kind of figure out what the why is typically behind that part that's showing up, then we can kind of look at what does that part need to feel okay with easing up, right? And it might mean more security at home, right? So maybe if it's more security at home, it's when's the last time you and your partner have been on a date without the kids,
Mhm.
right? Like an actual date, not just chilling on the couch watching a movie. When's the last time you and your partner had true intimate connection? If it is the thing of feeling not good enough, and maybe that is connected to a critical incident, maybe that is going to therapy to work through some trauma resolution work. So it really is about getting to the why. Why is this part showing up? And then what does this part of you need to feel like it wouldn't have to do this anymore? What would need to be different? Does that make sense a little bit?
Yeah, for sure. I think, and tell me what you think about this. It almost sounds like this approach to therapy is taking a really rational approach. And a lot of cops are really rational, right? So it's like rather
Mhm.
than, something that's a more amorphous, but it's like, okay, why is this the thing? Okay, now like what can we do about it to create a different environment, a different setting, right? So you talk about safety and
Mhm.
that could we talk about building a safer context or situation or environment. Let's give the example of your significant other or your partner and some of the prior notes that we had. It could look like, hey, I want to be better at home. I want to show up, and also I want feedback, and also I
Mhm.
want to like talk about some of these things that I'm doing that I don't love, and I'm doing that you don't love. And so, like, let's set a time the week after next, maybe it's like next Wednesday. Let's have a date night. I got my mom dialed in. She's gonna watch the
Yes.
kids, and we're gonna do a little picnic or we're gonna do a little date night out. And when we get back, we're going to talk about just like us and we're going to talk about it from a positive place. You make your contracts, you make your
Mhm.
promises like, hey, we are going to talk about this stuff that's uncomfortable because I love you so much and I want to get to a better place and just understand it better together and find some strategies, to
Mhm.
kind of identify that.
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely.
Just trying to roll some random things together. Where does it, if it does, have you seen it or do you have any thoughts about narrative therapy? Because I almost feel like there could be some sort of intersection for some types of people.
Yeah.
And if you feel comfortable explaining a little bit of what that might look like.
Yeah. So one cool thing about IFS for therapists that are listening is it can really be integrated into a lot of different therapy modalities. So that's,
Hmm.
I think, is really cool. And so if we're looking at integrating it with something like narrative therapy is big on like being able to rewrite the story, right? So
Hmm.
helping us to really rewrite the narrative that we're carrying around, which we do in a lot of other different types of therapy too. But I will sometimes, when I'm working with a client, or even really with my own parts that'll come up, I will write to or from that part. Right. So I will kind of what I would say blend with that part. So the part of me that's showing up and either have that part journal or write out what's happening and have that part in dialogue back. So, written back and forth conversation between myself and that part to help that part feel a little bit more seen, witnessed, and understood. and then being able to help that part rewrite the story so that it can release maybe whatever negative messages it's carrying that's supporting this job. Does that make
Yeah.
sense? Because I
Yeah.
know, again,
Mhm.
it's weird stuff. So I know I keep asking if it makes sense, but I know when I first learned it, like I said, I had to call my friend Bo and I was like, what the fuck is
Yeah.
this?
Yeah, and there's so many there in my mind's like the synapses are probably just firing all these different ways of where to take the conversation or like how to understand it
Mhm,
better for myself and maybe some members of the audience. So, and just you identified and you shared, a childhood experience, with cleaning up and, your
mhm,
grandmother being intoxicated, things like that. And so, whether it's that example or the couch example, one might identify that thing and say, okay, that's why I get really clean. So with that, you might even say, or someone may even say, okay, in that, I learned to be an independent, like very driven
mm,
person that likes things dialed in. And so then you're taking on ownership and some sense of pride in like how you are in
mhm,
recognizing there's a too much, too little. But at the same time, someone else might absent that narrative element, not trying to brand it too much or anything, but just saying like, yeah, if you just stay there without any modality, then you're like, yeah, that really sucked. And like, no
mhm,
one wants to have, and maybe some people do have those experiences. I mean, I've heard of them where a
mhm,
counselor or therapist, you just talk about how something sucked and you don't really feel like you're moving any direction to make the situation frame better or have
yeah.
takeaways or skills or tools.
Yeah. Yeah, and that is a part of it too. In traditional IFS, they're not going to really do any skills training or coping skill stuff, but really with my work, I do think it is important to give our parts tools and skills so that they can do their job more effectively, right?
Hmm.
Whether that's journaling, whether that's deep breathing, whether that's, incorporating more activity with your spouse or your significant other, and also to helping really the narrative of saying like, okay, again, going back to that choice versus compulsion piece, right? Yeah, I understand that if I don't have a clean house, it really triggers the part of me that was left in a unkept home, right? For
Hmm.
a long period of time. But if my house is messy at times now, at times, it doesn't mean that I have to do it right away or I will be stuck in that same place or that I'll
Yeah.
go back to that same place, right?
Hmm. Yeah.
And so it kind of gives that more compassion driven, like, okay, I don't have to do this, but I want to do this, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And a couple examples like that are popping in my head, like I've said numerous times, like I don't like talking about money. It makes me uncomfortable. I've been a good saver and my mom taught me well to do that, but my parents argued about money like every week that I can remember in my childhood.
Hmm.
So with this approach, it's like, okay, don't shame myself that I'm uncomfortable about money and that I hate when tax season comes around. It's not because I have all this debt. It's just because I don't
Yeah.
like talking about it. I don't like looking at the numbers. I don't like whatever. So anyone that's like considering going to business with me, they're like, whatever, dude. So, but all to say that that's like, it helps me understand that. I don't need to go in the weeds on like how I felt in that moment, but it just helps
Yep.
me understand and give that again, going back to self compassion, right? I almost quit during FTO, right? I could be that person that's like, oh my gosh, like I almost utterly failed in this thing that it was public in some way because all my loved ones and friends through background checks knew I was doing this thing.
Hmm.
But I got talked out of it, which shows I'm even more indecisive and I'm unconvicted in my thing. Rather than that, I could also just say, yeah, I got really in my head because I felt really bad at something. And since then, I realized, you know what? Sometimes you're going to be really bad at something and then you
Hmm.
become really good at something. And so I share that because I recognize a lot of people are in there, whether they're a new cop or they're applying, and then there's power in sharing. I'll even share this where a colleague recently said, "Man, like you put a lot of stuff out, and I couldn't do that." I'm like, "You don't have to." He's like, "Yeah, but like I'll tell you why I couldn't do that because I feel like anything I share out, like someone's gonna be able to weaponize that against me, and so
Hmm.
that's a frame thing." And I'm like, you know what? I can see that. For me, I feel like if I share it out, how can you weaponize it against me? Because I shared it
Yeah.
out. So it's just it's even another flip for people as something may become public or you get this complaint or you get IA'd or whatever and you
Hmm.
might be like I'm really uncomfortable with that. Well, you can certainly feel the way you feel, but just understand that there are other frameworks and mechanisms that can make you shift how you feel about it. And right, that's where I love the notion, not to just like wave this flag of narrative therapy, but just recognizing that we all have ownership of our
Yeah.
mindset and how we look at things.
Yeah, absolutely. And that is kind of a piece of IFS too. It's really empowering with a big focus on autonomy and responsibility.
Mm,
So being able to, again, get understanding. Once we understand why we're doing things we're doing, then we can take responsibility for why we're doing the things we're doing, right? Instead of
yeah.
deflecting or ignoring it or hiding from it. Once we understand why, and then we can give ourselves a little bit grace for the why, then we have more space to take responsibility for it and ultimately change it.
Yeah, yeah. I hope, when I share on the social, and I was just reflecting on how far this show has come or just my social media has come. A lot of
Mhm.
that I recognize when I'm doing it, but I try to my hope is that people acknowledge their own wins and their own progress, right? It's not about me. The whole project is about sharing and
Mhm.
community. And I hope that people can, when I share about, man, I really sucked at this and I stuck with it, it's not really supposed to be about me so much as it's supposed to be about focusing on what you feel like you're struggling with or you are holding on to and you're not taking that first step and just being okay with that. And in this whole conversation of self-compassion, I'm reflecting on a recent conversation with my almost 6-year-old, and we were talking about like best friends, and she was asking me and my wife like our best friends, and we kind of said like each
Mhm.
other, but also you, but it's different. And
Yeah,
and she was kind of just like waiting for us to ask her who her best friend was.
of course.
Like, "Who's your best friend?" I'm expecting her to say mommy, and I'm like, "Okay, I've resigned to that early on, I get it." But she said, "It's me." And, like,
Mm,
it's one of the most proud moments I've ever had, and I think the reason why I feel compelled to share that is I don't think many of us would say that about ourselves. But
mhm,
ultimately, like,
mhm.
you come into this world by yourself. I mean,
Yep.
that's kind of like a dramatic line, right? But, like, you are truly only by yourself your whole life at all moments, I should say. Of course, your mother's there, of course, like literally, and then you
Yeah.
have all these people in your life, but like you are only you have yourself at all moments, and we put all this blame and shame and this, whether you call it neuroses or these pressures from all these different things, and it's just a reminder,
Mm.
like give yourself some compassion and take a step and a pause and just think about that, because if we don't, I think we just lose it in the swirl of life and chaos and all that.
Oh yeah, 100%. And if we were to talk about true self-compassion as a practice, so there is research, a lot of heavily done research that shows there's three core components to self-compassion. So it's mindfulness versus over-identification. So looking at
Mm,
what is happening in the present moment as it is, not future tripping as we call it or ruminating on the past, but what is happening right now in the present moment. There's obviously self-kindness versus self-judgment. So being kind to yourself, treating yourself the way you would treat a good friend and talk to yourself the way you would a good friend. And then there's also this common humanity versus isolation piece. And I think that's a huge thing is as humans, we all struggle, right? No one is free from struggle. We all struggle, and that's just a part of being a human being, right? So if we can remember that as part of being a human, it means struggle and grief and death and loss and, trauma, even. Everyone has trauma to some degree too, right? Then maybe it helps us to be a little kinder to ourselves and why
mhm.
we are the way we are when we really take a step back and look at, I'm a human being, and being a good friend to ourselves first helps us to be better partners, better parents, better at our jobs. It just helps us to be better all the way around.
Yeah, 100%. I love how you even spelled it out in those very clear terms, right? Like I can't count how many times I've talked to somebody and some of my loved ones and closest friends, confidants had said the same thing back to me, which is, would you say what you're saying to yourself to somebody else or to me? And I'm like,
Mhm,
no freaking way. That would be absolutely disastrously mean, but also
mhm,
it's not even true. And then they'd kind of stare at me, right? Or I'd kind of stare at that person and they'd be like, okay, I see what you're saying. Whether it's like, okay, Sarge, you're right. Right? Like, don't
mhm,
be that way to yourself because you're identifying how it's not fair and it's not right. You certainly would never say that to even the things we say to ourselves, we wouldn't even say to someone we don't like, right? Even
right.
our frenemies or our kind of arch nemesis, like professionally, like I wouldn't say that because it's not even constructive, right? And it's
Mhm,
probably not even true. So,
mhm.
yeah, for sure, something that we could all stand to remember more often.
Yeah, something I kind of use with some clients, this has backfired once, but some clients I'll tell them, like, if you had a bat and you were hitting yourself every time you were talking to yourself like
Oh
that,
my
like,
gosh.
how would you look? And they're like, oh, I would be like completely bruised and battered. I'm like, so it would look like you were a victim of abuse, right? And they're like, oh,
Mm,
shit. Yeah, like I
mm,
am kind of being abusive towards myself when I'm treating myself in these ways that I would never dare say to another human, right? And I think sometimes that can help people to click into, like, I'm kind of an asshole to myself and I wouldn't be like this to anybody else. So why am I being like this to myself?
yeah, yeah, and there's that flip, and I also venture to guess when we're stressed, when we're overloaded, when we are edging towards burnout, and we have these contentions like hypervigilance, that is how we are more easily a-holes to other people that we don't mean to be, right? Whether it's Joe Public or whether it's like literally my spouse, right? It's like I snap because I go there so quickly with myself. And
Mhm.
so again, it's like practice makes perfect, or what is it? A perfect practice makes permanent. And so if we get these reps in and we take pause to do that, right? That presence and reflection, just
Mhm.
like slowing down, if anything, will make it smooth, right? Slow is smooth,
Mhm.
smooth is fast, and that becomes the new routine.
Yes, 100%.
Man. All right, Robyn. I feel so fired up, and I'm also being mindful of the time. And I don't want to keep you forever, but are there any kind of closing notes that you would leave listeners with in summary, and also things that you want people to think about?
Yeah, so I would just want everyone to see the different parts of themselves. So even the pieces of them that they hate the most as having a positive intent, right, for their overall system. It is serving a purpose, usually to protect or prevent pain from occurring, and really just letting yourself be curious about the why so that you can really start to help that part relax a little bit. What we resist persists, right? So
Mm-hmm.
if we're fighting against these parts of us and we're trying so hard to just knock them out, it's usually going to backfire. So if we can pause, be curious and compassionate, and just try to gain some clarity on why we're doing what we're doing, that in and of itself can be so relieving. So that would
Yeah.
be my takeaway.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I could not have summarized it better, obviously, because you're the expert and
Eh,
I'm along for the ride. But no, thank you so much, Robyn. And this will be in the show notes, but please tell folks where they can find you and learn more about what you're putting out.
Perfect. So I am on Instagram. My Instagram handle is Robyn Sonnier LPC LLC. I have a Facebook as well, but I mean, who, what is
Who
Facebook
uses
anymore,
Facebook?
right?
Yeah.
But I do have, the Facebook, which will link, sometimes when I'm doing workshops or events. And then of course I have a website. So robynsonnierlpc.com, which has anything you really need to know about me. I'm very, very transparent.
Yeah. Fantastic. Well, thank you so much. I really, really appreciate it. And I know the listeners
Yeah.
will too.
Yeah. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for tuning into another episode of Blue Grit Radio. As always, support this community by subscribing, giving us a 5-star review, and following, liking, and sharing posts on Blue Grit Wellness on Instagram. You can reach me there or email me at bluegritwellness@gmail.com. Be well and stay gritty.